Thank you. Welcome, everyone, to our first plenary of the Association of Heterodox Economics Conference. As we said several times, we're delighted so many of you are here. Before we begin, just a few housekeeping announcements. So this is a great problem for us to have, but it seems that the sessions in the room G75 is too small for the sessions to take place there. So all sessions that are scheduled in G75 will take place here. So you will have an abundance of space if your session is scheduled here. So that's just a quick thing. Also in the evening today, we have our annual general meeting. I know it's late, but it's going to be jam-packed full of exciting organizational details. Importantly about because I feel like I've heard a lot of grumbles about our registration fee. So we're going to give you an accounting of what we use all this money for. I can give you an important highlight that we gave out £9,000 worth of bursaries for early career scholars to come to the conference, including other things. So that's kind of what your registration fee goes to support, because we don't get paid to do this. We do this out of the insanity of our minds and goodness of our hearts. All right, so we're going to get started. I'm going to chair this session. Oh, also, we might do karaoke in the evening because we have a mic and a piano if you come to the AGM. Okay, so we're going to get started. For the first plenary, the title of the panel is Shifting Global Infrastructures from Logistics to the Dollar. I think it's extremely timely that we're having this session, given, well, the state of the world. So I'm not going to say more, given that we're already delayed. So I'll introduce our first speaker. We have two great speakers to speak on this panel on this topic. Could not have picked anybody better. So first off, we have Alex Colas, who is a professor of international relations in the School of Social Sciences at Birkbeck College, University of London. Alex has published on subjects ranging from piracy, food politics, Spanish responses to terrorism, imperialism, internationalism, and global governance. Alex directs the MSc in International Security and Global Governance and MSc in Food Politics, a bunch of other things at Birkbeck. We're very glad to have him here. He's also the co-author of this wonderful book, which I highly encourage you to read. I'll introduce Ramaa when we get to you. So Alex, you have 25 minutes. I'm going to warn you when you have 5 minutes and 2 minutes to stop talking.
Perfect.
Okay,
Thank
great.
you so much. Devika, should I use the microphone?
Yes, please.
Okay. Where are you going to be? Because
I'm going to sit over there.
okay, because I'm going to stand if I may.
Of course you can.
And that way I can see you and you can see me. Thank you very much, Devika. Thank you very much, everybody, for coming to this session. I co-authored this book, as Devika was saying, with Leon Campling. And when we started writing the book, we were very keen to look at the relationship between production and circulation in capitalist development. And our starting point was that circulation is the lifeblood of capitalism. And if that's the case, then the global oceans are its arteries. And with that basic metaphor in mind, we wanted to look at the maritime factor in that circuit of capital. So maritime logistics is, of course, one dimension of that circuit, where all manner of infrastructures, port terminals, warehousing, forward carriers, communications, and of course, labor supply contribute towards the final realization of value. And our claim in the book was that there is a distinctive maritime factor in the historical development of capitalism, arguably also in its origins, although I'm going to focus very much on development, rather origins, expressed among other forms in the provision of the so-called free gifts of wind, of currents, of biomass. Of course, I'm not going to be talking about fisheries or coastal fisheries, or indeed in the role, of course, of the oceans as an fast and open transport and communications highway. So our gambit was that looking at capitalism as a mode of production through and from the sea highlights some features that are common across the terraqueous space that capitalism occupies more generally. But we wanted to really hone down on the very specific terra aqueous features, those that are liminal, those that combine land and sea in different forms, that characterize the unique mobilization of social labor in the transformation of nature. So our claim is, was and is, that there is something distinctive about the sea in the reproduction of the capitalist circuit. So there are three core features of the contemporary maritime logistics I want to draw out today. And these are by ways of illustration of general tendencies and counter tendencies. They're not, I think you'll be pleased to hear, I'm not going to go into any sectorial analysis or any kind of predictions about the future. And this is the time where I also declare that in this duo that I did with Liam, he was the political economist, I'm the historical sociologist. So I'll put that up front in case there's any howlers. But our aim was very much to look at this, obviously, from a historical materialist perspective. And the three areas that I'm going to be focusing on are familiar to us all, but I hope you'll see the claim that there's a specific inflection in the blue water world is how it plays out. The first is competition. The second is integration, both horizontal and vertical. And the third is something that a headline that I was struggling to arrive at, which was, it basically boils down to extraneous or seemingly extraneous forces to markets, such as states or geopolitics, ecological crises, which we know in this room are central to the political economy, to the global political economy, but which bourgeois economists and those that manage shipping and the ocean-faring capitalism often see as extraneous or perceive or present as extraneous. Now, the big headline that I wanted to put to you up front, the takeaway, is that from all this work we did into the relationship between capitalism and the sea, we see logistics as a form of capitalist planning. That's really the main thing, that all of what I'm going to be talking about is about the orchestration, the coordination of multiple, very different moving parts in the accumulation of surplus value. And here, there is a premium in this orchestration on, and the creation of value through the movement of commodities. There is a premium on reliability, on predictability, on regularity. So the temporal dynamics of this are very important. Note that this is not always or necessarily about speed or speeding up. It is about managing different speeds, different times. There is in the shipping world, some of in this room, I guess will know, but there's a concept, for instance, of slow steaming, particularly with cargo that is bulk cargo that may not need to the faster turnover time. So the coordination, the orchestration is the deliberate term used in terms of the tempos that are involved. Now, the first thing to say is that there is no such thing as a shipping industry. There is no such thing as the shipping industry. It's a highly segmented sector, differentiated sector. We tend to focus on containers and container ships because they're more, I guess, jazzy. They carry 90% of everything, as the famous book suggested. But for example, combined bulk shipping, dry and oil, dominates the tonnage of the world merchant fleet today. And indeed, over 60% of global tonnage shifted by sea in the 21st century is associated to just two sectors, energy and metals. Only in 2004 did the registered tonnage of container ships overtake that general cargo. So you can see already that this is a representation of the different dimensions of the maritime, the blue economy, if you like, and we're focusing, leaving seafood aside, on container shipping, shipbuilding and repair. I'm also leaving aside cruise tourism, important as that is, especially when it comes to labor. But if you focus on the bottom two of that circle, containerization has only really become something of focus recently. So contemporary shipping is differentiated. It's differentiated materially, both in terms of what boats carry and the specifications of vessels designed to carry it. It's differentiated organizationally by length and frequency of voyages, time spent in port, sailing without freight. And it's also differentiated in the number of staff, both onshore and on board, crew necessary to manage and staff man, I should say, generally, because overwhelmingly this is a masculinized sphere, as I say, apart from the cruise sector. And it's also differentiated economically in relation to profit rates and how the shipping industry drives investment. In the typical number of transactions and, of course, in the dynamics of business cycles. Shipping notoriously goes through grand cycles of boom and bust, as I'll try and illustrate. And this means that there's different kind of behaviors. Focusing on container shipping, as I've said, we've got all kinds of different forms, bulk, non-bulk, LNG, tankers, very important tramp shipping, which is regional shipping that goes from along the coast. Very important to many parts of the developing world, of the global south. That diversity notwithstanding, I'm going to focus in the rest of my comments on container shipping mainly. And here, just to illustrate this competitive dynamic, in the post-pandemic moment, where you can see these, this is a visual representation, snapshot of the post-pandemic bust and boom cycle. Shipping and container operations in particular had a great pandemic for reasons that we know. They had super profits, but those super profits then have to be reinvested, sure enough, like most capitalists. And it's interesting, it's indicative that there were two strategies, for instance, taken by two of the biggest shipping firms, Maersk in Denmark and MSC, Mediterranean Shipping Company, based in Switzerland, interesting part of the maritime world. And they kind of reflect these kind of strategic differences within the container world. The MSC decided to invest in buying more ships, in ordering more boats. This was, if you like, an expansive reinvestment. Whereas Maersk has decided has opted for the strategy of more intensive exploitation of its existing assets through vertical integration by getting into all kinds of other storage, warehousing, forward logistics, and so on and so forth, including some marketing in other areas. And we'll see, it's an open, the question is still open, which one will succeed on their terms, but it shows how, again, even within that specific sector, there are different conceptions of how best to reinvest what were these super profits during the COVID period. There is another example that illustrates this existence of super cycles where there is capitalism in competition allow for individual enterprises, for instance, like Maersk, to order massive fleets, to invest in size. For those geeks in the room, triple E class container ships, we're talking about 18,000 plus, 20,000 plus boxes, 20-foot equivalent units. And these may make sense within the firm itself, but has deleterious consequences for the industry as a whole. One example was the bankruptcy of Hanjin, South Korean operator, in 2016 as a result of oversupply. So here is a sector that is, as I've been saying, differentiated. It is subject to all kinds of competitive pressures. The decisions that are made on what to do with that competition vary. But what we're talking about are very narrow margins at operational level, with notwithstanding these huge super cycles. Now, the second fact, or the second headline that I wanted to focus our mind on, is that one response to this competition is integration, is the alliances. And again, this is full of acronyms, forgive me, but these are all the major container shipping firms in the world. And as you can see, there's been a series of, even in the space of the last decade, a rearrangement of the decks, if you like, the chairs on the deck, with various major groups some of them very familiar, others maybe less so, into now consolidated just recently, actually this year, into 3 major alliances. These are alliances that are about economies of scale, obviously enough. They're about concentrating and controlling the supply chain at all possible levels, including very important berthing rates, including the freight rates themselves, including some of the backroom costs, if you like, back office costs, all the white collar work that goes behind this formidable circulation of capital. And yet, as you'll see, the concentration in these alliances represents the top of the top, a real concentration of MSC, Maersk as the European, and CMA as the European leaders, and then we've got East Asian operators, most obviously Costco and Evergreen, familiar to us from different contexts. You can see, though, that there's different histories to this. Some of these firms have a very long history rooted in colonial, imperial hinterlands, including the postal services, the transfer of military and other personnel, imperial personnel. Others emerge in the post-war boom of export-led development. They're part of the strategy of export-oriented development, for instance, in Taiwan. So, as you can see, these expressions of a horizontal integration are counter tendencies to a deeply competitive sector, but one where, once again, there is an element of planning, necessary planning in the long term because of these super cycles. A second expression of this, or a second response to this competition, is vertical integration. I've mentioned one form of that, which is Maersk's investment further down the supply chain. But a very interesting recent example is how manufacturers, in this case, an electric vehicle, an EV manufacturer, again, I'm sure it'll be familiar to many in the room. In fact, many in the room will know much more than I do about this, but very interesting from our perspective for Liam and I in this emphasis on capitalist planning is that BYD has invested in roll-on and roll-off ships by way of consolidating its own control over the supply chain. So manufacturers themselves want to control the whole value chain, and this move reflects a wider, broader strategy to integrate operations from manufacturing, logistics, and sales, a model actually popularized by Tesla. And I think what's important, especially for any, which I guess is most of us in this room, any economic geographers, those interested in political geography, is that with this initiative, BYD not only strengthens its export capabilities, but it also positions itself as a formidable competitor in the global EV race, not just regionally, which has been historically the case, particularly for Chinese manufacturers, but also globally, including in markets like South America. Now, let me move swiftly on to the third headline. I've been suggesting that looking at capitalism from and through the sea and the circuit of capital through competition and then these responses of integration can give us some sense of what the maritime factor contributes and the particularities of this relationship. A third element is that came from none other than the White House with the Trump's executive order, quote, restoring America's maritime dominance. Now, this seeks to, and I quote, revitalize and rebuild domestic maritime industries and workforce to promote national security and economic prosperity. End of quote. I've put a lot of text here, and forgive me, but it's the summary of this executive order. And what I find interesting in this is the realization, obviously enough, that the United States doesn't produce any ships, doesn't own any ships, and that China does. Now, you can see how that goes down with the present incumbent. But importantly, it's the way in which at least two elements of capitalism, the scene, converge here. One is an industrial policy, however misguided, and once again, there's details here that are to be seen, but there's a strategy to revalorize not just the shipping industry and shipping yards, but the shipping communities, many of them coastal communities, obviously enough, with echoes here of the so-called left behind communities, the parts of the United Kingdom that were former shipyards or indeed fishing centers and have been in long-term decline. But the second element, it's not just an industrial policy, it's also a national security policy. The combination of this geopolitical and geoeconomic, I think, is worthy of our attention. There are also protectionist measures to, I quote, enforce collection of harbour maintenance fee and other charges. And these involve trying to clamp down on the perceived cheating of exporting nations or nations exporting to the United States, landing in Mexico and Canada, then transporting commodities by land. And all of this, I think, points to the centrality of the state authority and the geoeconomic and geopolitical rivalry with the People's Republic in particular, where maritime logistics combines supply chain regulations with the national security objectives in ways that integrate production and circulation together with trade and naval power. There's echoes here for the historians in my mind, which is I'm closer to in spirit, to the earlier period of blue water strategy in US history in the late 19th century, early 20th century, with Teddy Roosevelt and the moment of the United States realizing that national defense wasn't sufficient. You needed global security. And for that, you need a blue water navy. You need to adopt, as one of the organic intellectuals of the time and often cited as a naval theorist, the iconic naval theorist Mahan would have said, you need to control the choke points. You need to control the free highways that are the oceans. And for that, you need to project not just naval power, but mercantile, merchant marine power. So I think there's scope here to read this kind of executive order. Early days, I know, in this particular Trump administration, but there's scope to read this as part of this neo-navalist moment, neo-mercantilist moment in US external relations. Now, let me conclude with some final reflections on, sorry, this is just some data showing what the White House, sure enough, knows, that it's East Asia that produces most of the world's ships nowadays, in all forms. But let me move finally to an environmental, ecological aspect, what I called in my introductory comments, the extraneous elements to the market. Shipping itself contributes relatively little to global greenhouse gas emissions, but the intensity, is quite low, but it is nonetheless an important player in the whole effort to decarbonize and reach net zero. And following the Ramaa Emanuel principle of never letting a crisis go to waste, the post-pandemic boosterism has combined in the maritime world, has combined decarbonization with digitalization to generate talk of so-called sixth-generation smart ports, ports that combine automation, autonomy, that operate automatically and autonomously, that in the language of one of the articles that I've cited here and that I recommend as an example of this technical fix, optimizes the seamless flow of vessels and cargo through the full unmanned automation and digitalization of the port, and is capable of real-time, big data-driven decision-making. End of quote. So you can see here some of the traditional, familiar fantasies about seamlessness and about automation, the absence of labor, all of this. Revolutionary technologies such as artificial intelligence, the Internet of Things, information and communication technologies have all been mobilized to model these principles in, for instance, the Tyneside port, North and South Shields, for those of you not from these islands, Northeast England, and again, one of these historic places of British imperialism amongst many very important fishing fleets. And the focus there, I'm going in the wrong direction, sorry. The focus there has been on emission reduction technologies and infrastructure. The idea here that we can move to electrification, to shore power, to renewables, and indeed energy storage. Remember that much of what comes under shipping can also be the reefers, the refrigerated storage. And you can see here the ambition. This is just an illustration of the kind of language that is coming into this sixth generation port infrastructure, which, as I say, tries to deal with some of the aspects, some of the complex dimensions of profit maximization, market share, value maximization, with the regulatory requirements increasingly coming from the International Maritime Organization or from regional organizations like the EU to decarbonize, a win-win situation in their language. With this come green ship corridors as well, policies that are all about linking up, say, Singapore to Rotterdam or LA to Singapore. And here, once again, there's this idea that the sector itself, with some multilateral and state, whether it be municipal or otherwise support, can and must develop best practices which have an infrastructural dimension in these kinds of idealizations, where the fuels that would replace diesel, bunker fuel, methanol, ammonia, LNG, LPG, and where, as I was saying, the electrification of port facilities is linked across the supply chain from port to port. I'll close with this. In all of these expressions of the attempt at reconciling the various competitive extra market dimensions, there is one big factor missing, and that is labor. The International Transport Federation's Transport Workers Federation has been working quite closely on these aspects. They want a green transition, but they want a just green transition. And it is fascinating to me, and with this I'll leave you, that although Labour is at the door, it seems not to have been let into all these discussions about green corridors. Thank you very much. I'll stop there, Devika, so that Anna has plenty of time.
Sorry, one sec. Let me just get your slides up. Where do I put? Hide. Yeah. Ah. Yeah. Did I? It's still there though. Yeah. This one? Sorry, we've shifted the teams and I've become. I don't know how to do this anymore. How do I hide floating meeting controls? All right, thank you. Sorry for being such an idiot about it. Okay, can I just grab the mic? All right, thank you so much, Liam. That was wonderful. I was particularly shocked by the fact that so much of maritime industry, as you said, is not really centered in the US in terms of ownership, which was quite surprising to me. Also loved your little pun about shuffling the chairs on the deck, but that's just me, which is great. I think it gives us a great segue to shifting into the next discussion of infrastructure, which is very much centered around the US, the shifting landscape of the global dollar. And for that, we have Ramaa Vasudevan, who is a professor of economics at Colorado State University. Her main research interests are international finance, open economy, macroeconomics, the political economy of development and finance, and Marxist and classical political economy. I have a bit more. She's particularly interested in investigating the implications of the current global crisis for the international financial architecture and imperial policy. Yeah, so I'm going to hand over to Ramaa so that I don't take much more time. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'm really delighted to be here, and thank you so much, the organizers, for making this happen and also for inviting me. So I'm going to be talking about a different kind of different infrastructure and a different global network, basically the infrastructure of the global dollar. And we are going through a moment of flux and a moment of where these systems are mutating, changing, transforming. And one of the things of this changing landscape, which the financial press in particular has latched onto as symptomatic of this shifting tectonic plates, is what happened after the announcement of the first announcement of the tariffs. Yeah, right? You had this anomalous reaction where the yields on the US Treasury and the dollar index, their relationship basically broke down. They've been moving in tandem. And at this point, where as the yields went up, the dollar index crashed. And so the tariff shock had set off Wall Street rumbles. And in this moment of crisis, there was a sell-off of treasuries. But what was unusual was when the treasuries were being sold off, instead of moving basically to the dollar, it went to Swiss francs, yen, gold, even Bitcoin, rather than dollars. And so you had a simultaneous sell-off in equities bonds without this dash for cash towards the dollar. And this was seen as a symptom of the erosion of the safe haven status of the dollar. And while this may be seen as a blip, and you had a subsequent auction of the 30-year bonds, which went off relatively smoothly, this is something which reflects the changes underway. And why it's interesting is because just 5 years back, March 2020, when the global pandemic happened, you had similar ructions in the US Treasury market. And at that time, the dollar index and the Treasury yields moved more closely together. So the point is, the dollar is world money. It is not just the funding currency, the vehicle currency, what international debt is denominated in. It's also a reflection of social power of global finance and of the dominant country, dominant key currency issuer. And US Treasuries are central to this. They are the anchor of the international financial system. They are the basis of liquidity, and they're also a hedge in crisis times. They are the safe asset. And so their prices, tended to rise when the stock and bond market slumped. But during the COVID pandemic, one did not see this pattern. When the stock and bond markets crashed, so did the treasuries. And you had a flight to safety, where you had this huge sell-off of treasuries, which are more liquid at a time when all assets were appearing toxic and unsafe. But at that time, you had a dash for cash. You had a dash for dollars. So even though you had this anomalous pattern of the US Treasuries moving, kind of falling along with at the same time that stock market and bond markets were falling, the dollar index rose. And it is this pattern which has unwound in the current moment. And to understand what is happening, one has to kind of look at the financial infrastructure of global liquidity. So, I mean, Perry Merling, who's kind of built a systematic scholarship around the money view, which is seen as the kind of analytical and domestic analog of the key currency approach, kind of has stressed this point about the public-private nature. So, on one hand, you have the mechanisms of liquidity are, you have a lot of private mechanisms which are independent of, outside the regulatory framework of the state. But even as these mechanisms grow, and they grow kind of in the interstitious kind of loophole and define loopholes in the regulatory architecture, when push comes to shove and when crisis happens, they need a public backstop. And in some senses, what you see is in line with the kind of explosion of private mechanisms and their metamorphosis, you have the expansion of the public backstop in line with that. The second aspect is that this global monetary system is hierarchical. And what's key to this hierarchy is the graduated or asymmetric capacity to turn the tide of liquidity in your favor. If it's a hierarchy, you settle debts at one level in the hierarchy with instruments created at a higher level. And those at the top have this privileged position of turning the tide of liquidity in their favor. They're not as liquidity constrained as those at lower levels of the hierarchy. And this is not just, a technical matter or a matter of, it is a matter of balance sheets, but the balance sheets also reflect kind of different political positions and different power positions. And so in the global context, this hierarchy is shaped by the core periphery asymmetry, in particular financial subordination. So I'm not going to talk too much about this aspect because I'll be talking about this in a panel right after this. So what I'm going to be talking more is about the US Treasury market and its changing kind of logic. But before I do that, I just want to stress that these two elements of public-private and hierarchy were also integral to the sterling gold standard before the First World War, in the heyday of the international gold standard. The private mechanisms were around the sterling bill, which was private credit money. And this was backed, or its privileged position as the anchor of international financial markets at that time was predicated upon the role of the Bank of England in guaranteeing them and its discount and advance activities to keep the sterling bills afloat. You also had hierarchy in terms of the management of the gold exchange standard in the colonies and core periphery relations over there in the British hegemonic period. But what is different now is that that world money is untethered from gold, and it is in that sense, it's a state credit money standard, which is tremendously more elastic. It is not restricted by deficits, whether trade or budget deficits. And it depends on this, provides an unlimited credit line to the issuer, which is why it can turn the tide of liquidity in its favor. But this depends on the demand for US Treasuries in the global market. And this demand comes on one hand from private investors who are seeking yield and returns, and on the other from public and some private, investors who are seeking safety. So this twin mandate of yield and safety is being kind of calibrated in the market for US Treasuries. At the time of the pandemic, the blip which we referred to earlier, you had, in response to the kind of the shock and the repercussions following that, foreign central banks were selling basically their assets to raise dollars and support the domestic economy. And there was a sharp fall about 160 billion in the US treasuries held by these foreign central banks in their accounts with the Fed in March 2020. Along with that, you had the unwinding of positions of leveraged hedge funds, which used repos, which is basically overnight markets where you get dollars by using US treasuries as collateral. So US treasuries become the base, and since you can use you can use it multiple times, the US treasury becomes the basis of a larger amount of liquidity. And as this unwinding took place, you had what is a liquidity margin spiral. As the selling increased, the prices fell. It created a hole in the balance sheet of these banks. It also triggered a rush for redemptions and a further sell-off of treasuries. The problem was that at this point, the primary dealer banks, which are key in the markets for US Treasury bills, their balance sheet capacity was restricted because of the regulatory rules that have been put in place after the financial crisis of 2008. So their capacity there's a sell-off happening, and in normal times, these primary dealer banks make the market. But at this point, given the scale of the sell-off and the balance sheet constraints of these primary dealer banks, they were not making the market. And so you saw the fall in price of US treasuries and the spike in the yields. And this was atypical. The plunge in US treasuries along with the collapse of stocks and bonds, but it was to do with this particular structure in the market. Okay. But this meant that the public backstop has to be brought into play, and the Fed stepped in with unprecedented, really formidable kind of interventions. The credit facilities, which are a reprise of what it did during the financial crisis in 2008. And these basically shored up the collateralized channels of liquidity and credit, which were being kind of tested at this time. Its scale was below what it had been in 2008. But along with this, you had more kind of what is called unlimited QE, the purchases of treasuries and agency bonds, and it played a bigger role in the pandemic compared to the financial crisis. So between September 2008 and September 2010, the Fed had added 1.5 trillion to its holdings of these bonds. In March, and between March and October 2020, it added 2.6 trillion. So the scale was significantly greater. And what this reflects is the critical role of treasuries in the repo channels of global dollar liquidity. If these channels had to be protected and restored, it required this action on the scale. You also had the further extension of the safety net, the Paycheck Protection and the Main Street Lending Program, which are funding for lending kind of schemes. And more significant, the backstop of the Fed was widened to include corporate bonds and bond ETFs, exchange traded fund shares, through its corporate credit facilities. So this was on the domestic front. The international dimension of the intervention in 2020 was basically an attempt to keep the spigot of global dollar liquidity flowing. So key to this was central bank swap lines, the top tier ones with the Bank of Canada, the Bank of England, Japan, the ECB, and the Swiss National Bank. These had been, they were a temporary response to the financial crisis of 2008, made permanent in 2010. And this network of swap lines has become a hub for coordinating the flow of liquidity and ensuring the stable functioning of the global financial system. In a sense, these key central banks, the allies of the US, had been drafted into supporting the global dollar regime. So this was cooperation and coordination at the top. Now, this safety net was reinforced and expanded in response to the pandemic. One, the top tier swap lines was, it became unlimited. There were no limits to it at this period. And it was available more cheaply at a lower rate and at a more frequent more frequently. So basically giving a lot of elasticity to this, to global dollar flows within this system. You also had the temporary limited swap lines with 9 other central banks in order to expand the pipelines of liquidity to the next tier. Okay, so, and the other big innovation at this point was the setting up of this facility for repo lending to other central banks, those who are outside, not in the top tier, not in the second tier, but let's say third tier of sorts. So this was the FEMA repo facility. And this basically meant, the swap lines are basically the ECB exchanges euros for dollars, right? You're offering the collateral of your currency, which you can issue in order to get dollars. The repo facility is you offer US Treasury securities in order to get dollars. So to access dollar cash, you needed to kind of use your stockpile of US Treasury holdings, right? And it's only countries or central banks which had had enough, a sufficient stockpile of these treasuries who could access this. And what this did was it boosted the capacity of central banks outside the swap network, the first 2 tiers, to access dollar liquidity, but do so without actually selling your US treasuries, right? So you are preserving that market for US treasuries and creating and basically addressing this demand for dollar liquidity, right? And so you had the safety net had a hierarchy, which corresponded to the hierarchy of the monetary system. And it's important to look at that period because that was also a period, that was also a Trump regime. And it was equally isolationist in terms of, for example, in the pandemic response, moving out of the WHO at a time when the global pandemic hits. So, so even though the politics was isolationist, the Fed was singularly effective in its international role. It forged cooperation within the advanced core to preserve the dollar as the anchor of the financial system through the swap lines. It spread a safety net to protect financial markets in the core, right, under the leadership of US global banks. It restored the private channels of liquidity, cross-border channels, and credit creations, which were anchored on the dollar, right? And when even if the US state actions on other fronts were seen as ineffective or too little, too late, this is one front in which the Fed basically kind of pulled out all stops. What about the present regime? We now have overt threats to the independence of the US Fed. And whatever one might say about the neoliberal framing of central bank independence, what we're seeing now is not a democratic accountability of the Fed, but an attempt to use coercion to constrain its activities directly. And this would have implications for its role as an international lender of last resort, its ability to actually provide a safety net when the financial markets tumble. You also have the big, beautiful tax and spending bill, and the prospective surge of public debt, I mean, by more than 2.4 trillion. There's been the downgrade, the Moody downgrade of the US credit rating. And you have geopolitical fractures and the upending of the rules of superintendence of the US empire. The traditional alliances, the cooperation of the core, all that is up in question, and I need to rush. Okay, so there's a retreat from the imperial rule in forging the consensus among the core. And there's a changing landscape. So key point, the US Treasury issuance has skyrocketed, 29 trillion as of now. And not just the US, you can see there's been high spending since COVID has meant global sovereign bonds have grown, but they've grown a lot. I mean, they're still largely they've grown in developing countries, but advanced economies are issuing a lot of bonds. Traditionally, the difference, another part of the asymmetry between the core and the periphery was that the borrowing costs of the periphery were much higher than the core. But now we see, again, rising interest rates in the core, right? A spectacular rise in the rate of issuance. And you also have a changing creditor base for the periphery. So it includes a private non-bank financial intermediaries, hedge funds, asset management funds, vulture funds, all of that. It also includes new bilateral creditors, China, yes, but also the Gulf states. So this is a new kind of geopolitical context. In this context, even though US Treasury securities held by the rest of the world have been rising, their share, foreign holdings as a percentage, of all US Treasury secretaries has been falling from 50% to about a third. And a lot of it is central bank holding because foreign private holdings has not fallen as much. And where the slack has been taken up is by hedge funds, who since 2012 have really become big players. Their exposure in the derivative trades around US Treasuries has been rising, both long and short. And we see a changing landscape where you move from, the private mechanisms have mutated from Eurodollar, which are unsecured lending, to collateralized market-based mechanisms, which are repos, where you exchange treasuries for dollars, and FX swaps, where you exchange your currency for dollars. The fact that the benchmark has shifted from LIBOR to SOFR, to the SOFR is not only because the LIBOR was on disrepute, but it was completely inadequate to these collateral as a measure, a benchmark for these collateralized mechanisms. The players have also changed, and one of the most significant things has been the rise of asset managers. And there's been a shift in the investor base in the US Treasury market from official sector, foreign central banks, to long-term and long-term investors towards leverage traders. Foreign official holders are less price sensitive than leverage traders. And leverage trades by hedge funds is a singular weakness in the treasury markets. Their funding is from prime banks and repos has grown as a source of funding for these. Dealers, as I mentioned earlier, have a lower capacity to intervene in times of stress. And so you have the cycles of illiquidity, tighter margin requirements, and a fall in treasury values. This makes public market intervention necessary. We saw it in 2019, we saw it during the pandemic. So basically, the strategies of highly leveraged hedge funds are making the US government treasury market more fragile. I won't go into the trades, but what is key is they're hedged, they're borrowing in order to transform small margins into huge profits. And so that is a very shaky base for, the market which anchors the international financial system. It's dependent on price-sensitive, leveraged speculators. But if that's not alarming enough, let me alarm you a little more. Crypto and stable coins have emerged as a libertarian alternative to market-based channels of securitization and shadow banking, and it's kind of finance for its own sake. But whatever one would say about crypto, and the elements of this technology have become mainstream, in particular tokenization, blockchain, and smart code. And especially in cross-border transactions, they offer the possibility of speeding up the settlement process tremendously. And for developing countries, they offer the hope of being able to escape the weaponization of the global dollar. All of this is boosting kind of this notion of central bank digital currencies and the experiments outside the US, the Enbridge, the Jura, which are basically exploring this. This is also the terrain where China is testing and challenging the global hegemony of the dollar. China has first mover advantage. It already has the yuan, which used domestically, which is issued and regulated and guaranteed by the state. There's an ambitious blockchain-based global platform, again, state-owned. So the state maintains a tight rein on banks and the private fintech sector, even in the digital terrain. In the US and its embrace of crypto, you've had the mainstreaming and you had the blurring of the line between crypto and traditional finance. You have a tighter imbrication of big tech and big finance who are trying to leverage the digital infrastructural capacity in order to basically monetize and weaponize kind of the footprints of everyday digital activity for profit. This is what I call the Silicon Valley, Wall Street, Washington nexus. Now, the Biden administration, kind of sensitive to China's first mover advantage, talked about reinforcing American leadership in the global financial system and at this technological frontier, and started this thing of having a centralized US digital currency to consolidate and exploit the global network effects that undergird dollar hegemony. The aim was to reinforce the Washington Wall Street nexus and control the global rules and standards of digital finance. What we have now is a kind of the scary prospect of crypto dollar. So apart from you have the political patronage and regulatory latitude and the gala dinners provided by the current regime, two holders of crypto. You have the Bitcoin Reserve Fund, which proposes to extend the public safety net to this sphere. You have the Genius Act, which is trying to provide a regulatory framework for stablecoins, digital tokens which are pegged to safe assets. And they're seen as critical to speeding up cross-border payments. And in this act, there's a loophole for offshore issued stablecoins like Tether. There's a provision for non-financial companies like X and Meta to issue stablecoins. And so in this, what is implicit is the path undergirding global dominance of the dollar in a fissuring global order when the US is facing political dysfunction and secular stagnation, and using stable coins backed by US treasuries and cash, not a CBDC, not a central bank digital currency, as a tool of monetary and geopolitical policy. There's already a growing footprint of stable coins in the US treasury market, and they have an asymmetric impact on US treasury yields. Outflows basically raise yields by three times. That inflows lower the yields, right? So outflows have an asymmetric impact in bringing down treasury prices. Stable coins are also subject to fragility. in a recent BI study that not a single stable coin has maintained its parity, whether it's linked to treasuries or a crypto asset. Last. So the World Financial, which is World Liberty Financial, issued, Trump-owned company, issued a stable coin and USD1, which has just been used by the Abu Dhabi Investment Fund for its $2 billion investment in Binance, a crypto exchange. Shape of things to come. As I said, we are in a state of flux and the tensions are multiple. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Ramaa. That was wonderful. Quite magisterial account, I would say, of the dollar infrastructure. Okay, so organizers, can we go till 3:35? Okay, so we have 20 or so minutes for questions. Can I see a show of hands? And I will be abusing my privilege as chair. But until then, okay, I see 1, 2, 3. I see only men. I'm sorry, that cannot happen. Okay, we'll start with you while I give some time for folks to think of more questions. So you have the mic? Okay, I'll give this to them. So you do Paolo, Angus, and then that person.
Okay, thank you very much. And I'm sorry for being man. Hopefully some girls and women will speak now. Yeah, so very briefly, the first speaker illustrated the situation, which is especially well seen in the case of the United States with the left behinds, while the second speakers spoke quite a lot about the financial architecture. So I was just wondering, this is especially a question for the second speaker, if you could maybe try to establish some link between the financial architecture that you were illustrating. Yes. Oh, yeah. Okay, let me try it again. Yeah, so just very briefly, maybe the link between the financial architecture and some phenomena, economic and financial phenomena that were affecting people, especially in the United States, such as sellers inflation and others. So how does the financial architecture relate to phenomena such as sellers inflation and things that impact the left behind? Thank you so much.
Question how it relates to the sellers inflation and
Generally conditions that affect everyday people. So how does financial architecture relate to that? The left behind.
Okay, I'll try to be quick because this is the first of several exchanges that will continue into the next talk, and then the panel that we're doing that Mona is chairing on Friday on this issue of the dollar and the international financial and monetary architectures. Very quickly, most of you know, or a lot of you know, that Piketty published a piece on the value appropriation and unequal exchange last week. Uneven exchange, right. And he does cite the Patnaik's, but only on empirical grounds. There's no theoretician of our tradition that is acknowledged. But it has this irritating quality, right, that a lot of Piketty stuff has, because it gets to real things. And one of the really interesting things that they get to is this, that in the golden age of imperialism, the international imbalances were actually different than the ones we have today. Core economies have always been able to appropriate material goods, so they run trade deficits. But in the classical age of imperialism, they also had incredibly positive income accounts. So they were basically running a positive overall current account. Whereas in the case of the US hegemonic period, the current account is actually negative because the income account has not been sufficiently positive, which effectively means that there is appropriation of rest of the world produced goods via the standard of the dollar as some kind of reserve asset. So this, it's not even monetized, it's the opposite of monetized. You have transformed your place in the monetary hierarchy as a form to extract what some of us have referred to as a tribute. Now, you can only do that with inconvertibility. Now, what's really interesting, and this is my question to you, is the following. To add to your doomsday, the US income account has now turned negative. Okay, so even on that account, you are bleeding net negatives to the rest of the world. So even though these people are all trying to crypto their way out of blah, blah, and we've lived now, what, since the crisis, a little bit of a fairy tale economy where the dollar's position in coordination with the position of other reserve issuers has allowed macro stances that in other moments of history would have been punished. The reality of things is starting to assert itself in these macroeconomic changes. And I think that's going to be very interesting, but especially where there is no obvious alternative to park the reserves. The last thing the world needs is the Germans running the world money. No, really. And the Swiss can do it and blah, blah. Anyway, I'll stop here, but I just wanted to throw that your way, get your comments, and we'll get started.
Thanks. Angus? Where's Angus? Oh, he's back there.
Yeah, thanks both. Super interesting. I want to kind of like try and draw the two talks together. Because Ronald, like the other side of US dollar being world money is the fact that you can buy and sell things in world money. And Adam Haniya has done some great work around world money, dollar and oil. And the fact that oil markets are kind of like controlled in dollars. This is true of other commodities. And this is kind of very much what Alex was talking about, the kind of like infrastructures of that and how that plays out in physically bringing stuff like around the world. And I wonder, in your reflections around kind of the dollar hegemony and where stablecoins fit in, like that role of dollar as kind of the universal kind of equivalent that you can use to buy and sell stuff, even like in London, the major commodity markets are priced in dollars, right? How does the stablecoin and the cryptocurrency story that you're telling fit into that, right? And what are the limits to that, given that stuff is still priced, bought and sold in dollars? So you still need dollars, right, in order to get kind of these central things. And that is a very important part of dollar hegemony.
We have a question, gentleman here in the center. Once again, good questions from.
Hi, and thank you for the presentation. Earlier this year, Anil Kashyap from University of Chicago published more or less a similar paper explaining, well, the first part, not the second part of your paper. And I have a question, actually, I mean, related to your work, and also it's coming inspired by their work. So they said that the QE, basically buying bonds, treasury bonds, in March 2020, and also in the recent crisis, or whatever we call it, on the bond market, was not a monetary policy, but was a financial stability act. And it's important for the central bank to differentiate, to signal that it's not a monetary policy, it's a financial stability. And well, at the end, they suggest that central banks should give this signal by shorting treasuries at the same time. So to separate the monetary policy of buying back bonds and financial stability. I wanted to know whether, is it important actually to give such signals? I mean, how it can go wrong if this signal is not given. Thank you.
The signal is not.
Even, I mean, basically, if I mean, the bond market players thinks that this is a monetary policy, it's not a financial stability thing.
I think we have one person there, question, and then we're gonna have to give them a chance to answer. So, any last hands? Speak now or forever hold your peace until tea. Okay.
I want to, I'm not an economist, and a lot of terms I don't understand. And I want to thank you for the two talks. I felt I understood the first one, because it was to do with the realities of being a shipping magnate and so on, and the everyday realities. And I thought I understood it. And then I was completely mystified about the second talk, which was about finance. I don't know whether it's deliberate, but the contrast between the two, I don't know what question to ask But because most of the questions have been to the second speaker, I might ask, what is the problem with capitalist driven shipping? I mean, I know there is a problem, but do you have a clear statement of what it really is and what to do about it? Okay.
Excellent, thank you. So I have some questions for both of you. Alex, one is to do with this, as I said, I mentioned briefly that I was struck by, in terms of ownership, lack of US control on sort of the firms that are biggest players. And it seems also in terms of like the volume of shipping and shipping routes. However, it doesn't seem to have like a big effect on global hegemony of the US in trade. In the sense, how come that it does, despite the fact that it doesn't own, in a way, if we see this as the infrastructure of global shipping and of global trade, that despite the fact that it doesn't control most of it, at least in terms of ownership, it still controls it in terms of the fact that most trade, like it's one of the biggest deficit countries in terms of merchandise trade. It's consuming so much from the rest of the world. How do we square that circle? Is that, once again, maybe the obvious answer is that US hegemony exerts in various ways? And therefore, like, it's a market that you can't ignore. In that light, is there really a shift in terms of policy when it comes to, or does there need to be a shift in terms of policy when it comes from like what's happening now? And I guess one is a question which is related to this, but not very much. Maybe you didn't really mention it in your talk, because you mentioned it about naval power. And I feel like a lot of the way, for instance, you know, like the blockade by Houthi rebels, and that's like really up at like the intensity with which the US military establishment is upset by that, is quite striking. And I'm wondering if there's sort of like, this is obviously, maybe I'm wrong, you could correct me, and like, how is it that such a tiny sort of blockade, in a way, of course significant in many big moral terms, I would argue, but it has unleashed this kind of response in the context of your history and political economy of the oceans? I would love to hear about that. Ramaa, that was amazing. Thank you so much. I was wondering, you talked about how, like, part of the shifting global landscape that you mentioned, you talked about how there's been threats to the independence of the Fed. But like, the Fed has never been independent. And maybe, you know, this is like pie in the sky thinking, especially because, like, as you mentioned, and like, again, this is part of my research as well, that we showed that like it's US allies that have access to Fed swaps. So how is it that US geopolitical allies, which should have nothing to do with Fed independence, with the independence of the Fed, how is it then? So if that is the case, like, is it really a threat to the US dollar plumbing? If it is the case that, okay, now Trump is like, oh yeah, we don't like these guys, and we're going to figure out more ways to control it. So yeah, I don't know how to square that circle. And I guess the other thing that I thought, because you focused a lot on, I thought it was really fascinating that hedge funds have increased holding in US treasuries. It's funny because I think like, and when we look at developing countries, when, you know, banks in developing countries hold government treasury securities of their respective governments, they're like, oh, this is like repressed financial system. So I thought that was very funny. So that's just a little comment. However, you focus a lot on like stablecoin and crypto. And I know it's like a growing trend, especially in consumer finance, but how much of the global financial system is really underpinned by that? Because, you know, not that long ago, we had a big crypto exchange go bust. It didn't change anything at all. So like, does it really matter if that, as long as the fact is that the only crypto that has really like captured our attention as a real viable anything is stable coins, because it's backed by the US dollar. Like, because but so does it really matter? Like, I guess I don't share your worry. And I would love you to comment on that. Okay, so I'll hand it over to you guys. We have 2 mics now.
If you want, or if you want to reflect on.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay, all right. We'll do that division of labor.
Yes.
Thanks very much. Is this working? Yeah, it is. Okay. I think so. What's the problem with capitalist shipping? I mean, the quick answer is the same problem as capitalism generally. So exploitation, super exploitation in particular, the concentration that we've been talking about, the oligopolistic dimensions, the the concentration of capital in the geographical concentration of capital in the global north. But I would say that there, if we're talking, for instance, let's focus because of time. I think one of the most pressing crises that involve shipping is the ecological. Then the issue isn't with the shipping firms. They're often conflated with the shippers. That is the cargo owners. The oceanic maritime economy, the blue economy, has one of the characteristics that I mentioned is that the ownership is deeply segmented and differentiated, and hence the orchestration that I was talking about. And if, for instance, those of us that want to just transition, that want to shorten supply chains, that want to consume less, you don't even have to go down the degrowth route. I'm sure there'll be plenty of discussion that in other contexts here. Then the problem is with the cargo holders, it was with the Amazons of this world and the Walmarts and so forth. It's not the shipping industry in itself. I think that there's another dimension which is worth thinking about it, and that is I'm having a little second bite of the cherry, which I didn't have a chance to mention, that the greening, the greening of the shipping industry is, of course, itself a competitive strategy. It's folded into the competition between those 10 big, or the 3 big alliances and the 10 big firms that I was referring to that can afford to reinvest and buy vessels that have dual use, or that might just use renewables, hydrogen or whatever it may be. This applies also to port terminals, where the ownership is very much the management of the port might be differentiated from the actual ownership of berths, or in other words, or sometimes there's municipal oversight or national, regional one, and there's regional competition, of course, between port terminals to attract customers. So far, so familiar. For the port adjacent populations, including those that have historically lived off, that is the working populations, there is a politics of distancing, lack of accountability, while sparing all the detrimental. Yeah. Oh, thank you very much. Yeah, turn it on and off. Thank you. But for the port, for the city part of the port, and those populations that historically either worked from or lived next to ports, I'm thinking of the European experiences that I'm slightly more familiar with, but I'm sure there's plenty other examples in places like Valencia or the Piraeus. There is a problem. What's the problem with capitalism and capitalist shipping is the port terminals, the automation, the loss of jobs, the loss of communities, the destruction through dredging and landfill and expansion of megaports. All of that contributes, I think, to the material weekly, daily lives of people in those areas. I will say finally that, of course, I say of course, it's not always that obvious, but many of the legal phenomena, legal feints associated particularly to neoliberal capitalism, like for instance the offshore or the financial, the flags of convenience, the offshoring of ownership to flags like Liberia, or as I was mentioning, landlocked countries like Bolivia or Mongolia, not just of the shipping, the ownership of the ships themselves, but also now increasingly the recruitment of workforces for shipping or fisheries from these inland places. I mean, again, historically, it's not necessarily the coastal parts of South Asia, but it's Sylhet or it's Punjab that have produced the workforce that manned, again, mainly the world. So I see those as infrastructures, networks, infrastructures in the longue durée that the shipping industry, broadly conceived, invented. The figure of the Lascar is a figure that is reproduced in some respects in a racialized form in the overrepresentation, say, of Filipino seafarers in shipping, to a lesser extent perhaps in fisheries where it's more diversified. But those kinds of stark relationships between the castle of a ship and those in the lower deck are reproduced in the infrastructures of labor supply that I mentioned. Very quickly, on Devika, your question about Houthi attacks. I mean, they clearly have had an impact, and that is because, as we know, the Western Indian Ocean and particularly the Suez route is whatever 70%, I think, of maritime trade goes through there. I think that I'll be careful of overestimating the power of either Houthi attacks or the power of those kinds of blockages. Part of the orchestration and planning that I've been talking about involves insurance and risk assessment and diversions. Much of the industries turn towards supersize or so-called Cape-size vessels is in response to the possibility of rerouting through the Cape of Good Hope through South Africa. So there's a great deal of the planning involves agility, right? We all know that strategy does involve tactics. They're dialectically related, and so the agility that comes with those rerouting allows for factoring that in. Interestingly, somewhat as you mentioned in my jack of all trades and master of none kind of approach to things, my interest in the sea emerges in a way through piracy. And in terms of the contemporary moment in the early 20th century, you recall, or off the coast of Somalia for a good 5-6 years, there was a crisis of circulation through the Gulf of Aden. That concerned everybody who's a major trader, especially the Chinese. They were involved in the counter-piracy operations. And I think, to be somewhat chauvinistic and maybe a little bit provocative, the strait that matters is not the Red Sea, it's not the Gulf of Aden as much as the Strait of Hormuz now, for the reasons that we all know in this particular juncture. So I'd say that you're spot on. There is, these choke points matter. And to conclude, the deal, again, in very panoramic terms, but the deal after World War II was the United States has naval power and the merchant marine can be carried by others. Because in the end, Alfred Mahan, whom I mentioned, was right. Particularly in the post-war situation, if you recall, the US was absolutely supreme across all the oceans. I mean, its only real rival, eventually the Soviet Union, barely got a warm water port until the 1970s in the Wars of Liberation, and when they got access to the Mediterranean. So it was the Black Sea, or it was the Baltic and Vladivostok, and real problems with ice and so on and so forth. So the US, as we know, had naval bases in every single continent, controlling every single sea, and that's the deal. They're open seas, freedom of navigation, but you're going to use US dollars. You're going to mainly carry goods that are either produced in the US or for the US or by major allies, South Korea, Japan, so on and so forth. So I think that's been the setup. And again, there's people in this room that will have views on this that I'd be keen to hear. On whether Trump's sort of, I'm calling it neo-mercantilist or neo-navalist approach in that particular executive order, it's too early to say whether it's yet another example of a sort of, I want one too kind of attitude. Whether there is a rational kernel in an industrial strategy aimed, as I was saying, towards those former shipyards, I don't know. I mean, I'm struggling to think of how that would play out electorally or economically, but it may well be that that's part of the idea. Finally, whether this is part, is actually, there is a method in the madness, which is that the reshoring, nearshoring, friendshoring, the parcelization, and this turn towards a neo-protectionism is going to regionalize shipping routes, right? Whether we're going to see a breakdown in that interoceanic, the freedom of the seas principles. I doubt it myself, but I could well be wrong.
We have a lot of questions. If you could pick a few so we can end in 5 minutes. Thank you so much. Sorry
Yeah,
to
no, no.
press.
No, no worries. So let's start with the Fed independence. Now, and it kind of really, and I want to link that to the question about monetary policy and financial stability. I mean, the triple mandate goes also employment, but the Fed independence, I mean, it's not, it does not mean that it's not, I mean, it's still dependent on finance, on financial markets, financial players, its relationships in the, with, I mean, the revolving door between private finance and the central bank. And these cooperative relations which have kind of been formed, and they're not kind of, I mean, there were similar relationships which you had in the 19th century too, between Bank of England, Bank of France. So, I mean, and so this is part of its mechanism. And what I meant by the threat to independence is again, I don't is the is when isolationism and forces the Fed to pull back from this role. Okay, and it didn't do it. 2020, it didn't happen. But I think this time is slightly different, and so it remains to be seen. And here the question about, I mean, central banks arose as protectors of financial stability. That was the origin. Monetary policy came later. Employment mandate came later and is limited. So I think the central bank, and that is the public-private mandate. I mean, central bank, they are responsible for stability of the financial system, and then there are these other policy in terms of employment and price stability included in that. So on one hand, the dominance, I mean, the post-war period saw financial stability being it was not explicitly part of the mandate. It's only after 2008 it becomes more explicit, even though the actions are being taken place continuously. And what is even more interesting is it is only after this that responsibility for the global financial system is also explicitly acknowledged in the minutes of the Fed, right? In this context, the policies can be in tension with each other, and that brings me to the tension between, you have this long period where the financial system has grown addicted to this low interest rate regime, which is, pull out the safety net, quantitative easing, it's awash in liquidity. And the financial system has grown addicted to it. The resurgence of inflation after the Russian invasion in Ukraine, and basically set in motion this tightrope act, because you raise interest rates because that is the only policy which is adopted to deal with inflation. You don't actually use price controls or any other policy which would actually boost supply. It's this raise interest rates, which is basically solving inflation on the backs of workers by creating a recession. So raise interest rates to solve inflation, but then the financial system, it threatens financial stability because, and we saw the first rumbles of the Silicon Valley Bank fiasco, right? So that's the tightrope act, which is being negotiated in the current conjuncture, and so one of the ways which it is being done is this recourse more to short-term bills rather than long tenor bills in the auctions, right? Which sometimes got activist, like fiscal policy by the, a subverted fiscal policy. So I think there's this tension, and its resolution is always political, and it remains to be seen. And right now the two financial stability and price stability, macroeconomic stability seem to be in tension.
Ramaa, I'm sorry to cut you off. Okay. Is it okay if we keep the discussion going over tea?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Fine.
Thank you to both our speakers. That was wonderful. Sorry to rush everyone. It's because we started late, but we want to keep sure we're on time. So we have a short tea break now. We will recommence at 4:05. And just a reminder that all sessions that were scheduled in G75 will happen here. So.
I believe money don't get along. The language is different. There's something about.
Yeah.
Sorry to meet you.
Yeah.
Sorry, I have to interrupt.
Sorry? Yeah.
So I realized.
Yeah. Oh, got it. Okay. Okay, that's good. It's just that how people can get their slides.
Yeah.
But I mean, it's like. Yeah. Sorry.
Yeah.
I know exactly, and that's the right. Say no. And
Yeah.
people do, and then if you don't, then that's gonna be different before the laptop.
Yeah, ideally you do save on the desktop. There's a few. Yeah.